Okay, I hope that you are practicing your trig identities every day. We are going to look at page 2 of the worksheet using trig identities. So if you don't have that worksheet, stop the video for a second while everybody gets the worksheet. Okay, and let's look at number 3. We're going to work a few examples together, and then you are going to have to try some on your own. Okay, so notice the directions say to write each expression in terms of sine and cosine and then simplify. So what that's telling us, this is one of the hints that we're going to use as we're solving and proving. If there is a function in there that is not sine or cosine, we're going to find an identity that equals that so that we can substitute it in. So for example, on letter A, tangent is not sine or cosine. But you have a quotient identity. If you will look at yesterday's notes with all the identities on there, it should say that tangent is equal to sine over cosine. So we're going to replace tangent with sine over cosine. And since the two original functions were multiplied, and I now have a fraction, I'm going to put cosine over 1. Okay, so if I'm multiplying cosine over 1 times sine over sine, you will notice that the two cosines can cancel because you have one on the top and one on the bottom. So all I have left is sine of x. So my original expression will simplify to sine of x. Okay, the only way to get better at these is to practice, 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 and to know your identities. Okay, so let's look at letter G. Okay, this time we have 3 functions multiplied together, but again we need to change everything that is not sine or cosine. So the first one is sine. We're going to leave that as sine x, and I'm going to go ahead and put it over 1. Okay, cotangent. Now you have 2 different identities for cotangent. One is 1 over tangent, but we want things in terms of sine and cosine. So if you will look at your quotient identities for cotangent, cotangent is equal to cosine over sine. So we're going to replace cotangent with cosine over sine. And then secant, you have a reciprocal identity for secant that says that secant is equal to 1 over the cosine. Okay, so now that we've replaced everything that's not sine or cosine, let's multiply and let's see what happens. And you will notice that there is a sign in the numerator and a sign in the denominator. Those will cancel. Cosine in the numerator and denominator will cancel also. So all I have left is 1 over 1, which equals 1. Okay, now let's look at letter D because it's a little bit different than the others on the page. Okay, letter D is a division problem instead of a multiplication. Okay, so let's look for something that equals secant, and you have a reciprocal identity for secant that we just used, which was 1 over cosine, divided by cosecant also has a reciprocal identity, 1 over the sine of x. And when you divide fractions, we know that we're going to flip the second one and multiply. So I'm going to move down here so I have space. So 1 over cosine I'm going to leave the same. And when I flip the bottom, instead of 1 over sine, I will have sine over 1. Okay, and I can't cancel anything this time, so I'm going to multiply it together. 1 times sine is just sine of x. Cosine times 1 is cosine of x. Okay, but now look at your list. Sine over cosine is an identity. Okay. Sine over cosine is equal to the tangent of x. So in its most simplified form, we would come out with tangent of x. You want to keep looking for more identities you can substitute or simplify, things that you can cancel out. Okay, so I want you to pause the video right here and take 5 minutes to work on B, C, E, and F. Okay, so let's look at the ones that you just worked on. In part B, we need to replace cotangent, and we could use 1 over tangent, but that's not what the hint said to do. We want sines and cosines to start with. So we're going to use the quotient identity of cosine over sine times sine over 1. The sines will cancel, so we end up with cosine of x. Okay, let's look at part C. I'm going to replace secant with the quotient or the reciprocal identity of 1 over cosine. Cosine over 1. The cosines will cancel, and that leaves me with 1 over 1, or just 1. Okay, for letter E, the sine of x is fine. Cosine of x I'm not going to change, but tangent I'm going to write using the quotient identity, which is sine over cosine. Okay, now this time the cosines will cancel, but the sines will not. So if I have sine times sine on the top, that would be sine squared. On the bottom we just have 1 times 1, which is 1. Okay, so sine squared is going to be my answer. Okay, and for letter F, let's change secant to 1 over cosine. Tangent is sine over cosine. Cosecant would be 1 over sine. Okay, so the sines will cancel out. And this time I end up with 1 over cosine squared. Cosine times cosine is cosine squared. But we don't like to leave trig functions in the denominator of a fraction. Okay, so 1 over cosine is the same thing as secant. But if I've got 1 over cosine squared, then I'm going to write that as secant squared. Okay, now on your homework, your answers will be matching, so you won't have to try to figure out when to stop. You can stop when you get one of the answers that it matches to. Okay, and we will continue working on this, but you're going to have to know your identities so that you will be able to substitute, and the better you know them, the easier these problems will get.